Hello everyone. Today's video I'm gonna start something a little different than what I've been doing. A series, if you will. Today I want to do a soft-spoken ASMR and start reading you guys through this book. It's something I thought about doing in a few videos ago as kind of a side series to what I've been doing. I don't know how well this is gonna go. This will not be audiobook quality. I'm gonna basically read this on the fly, so there's bound to be many stumbles in my words as I read them. I will try my best, but I cannot guarantee there will not be any mispronunciation or anything like that, or maybe a sentence will not quite come out as clear as I want it to. I'm not really used to reading out loud, so that's something I thought would be fun to listen to, and I'm able to share my books, maybe even in some sense read them for the first time, for my first time, for you guys as well, though the series I'm starting with is a book series I've already read through. Each video is going to cover one chapter, I think, so that's how I'm going to lay this out. So yeah, without further ado, probably going to actually read with the dust cover off. Just will make things a little bit more easier to maneuver the book. Okay, here we go. I'm going to be reading The Demon King, a Seven Realms novel by Cinda Williams Shyma. Chapter 1, The Hunt. Han Alistair squatted next to the steaming mud spring, praying that the thermal crust would hold his weight. He tied a bandana over his mouth and nose, but his eyes still stung and teared from the sulfur fumes that boiled upward from the bubbling ooze. He extended his digging stick toward a patch of plants with bilious green flowers at the edge of the spring. Sliding the tip under the clump, he pried it from the mud and lifted it free, dropping it into the deerskin bag that hung from his shoulder. Then, placing his feet carefully, he stood and retreated to solid ground. He was nearly there when one foot broke through the fragile surface, sending him calf-deep into the gray, sticky, superheated mud. "Helena's bloody bones," he yelped, flinging himself backward and hoping he didn't land flat on his back in another mud spot. Or worse, in one of the blue water springs that would boil and the flesh from his bones in minutes. Fortunately, he landed on solid earth amid the lodgepole pines, the breath the breath exploding from his body, and heard fire dancers scrambling down the slope behind him. Stifling laughter, Dancer grabbed Hand's wrist and hauled him to safer ground, leaning back for leverage. "Well, change your name, Hunts Alone," Dancer said, squatting next to Hand. Dancer's 20 face was solemn, the startling blue eyes widely innocent, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "How about Wade's? In the mud pot. Mud pot for short." Hand was not amused. Swearing, he grabbed up a handful of leaves to wipe his boot with. He should have worn his beat-up old moccasins. His knee-high footwear had saved him a bad burn, but the right boot was caked with stinking mud, and he knew he'd hear about it when he got home. "Those boots were clan-made," his mother would say. "Do you know what they cost?" It didn't matter that she hadn't paid for them in the first place. Dancer's mother, Willow, had traded them to Hand for the rare Deathmaster mushroom he'd found the previous spring. Ma'am hadn't been happy when he'd brought them home. "Boots?" Ma'am had stared at him in disbelief. "Fancy boots? How long will it take to grow out of those? You couldn't have asked for money? Grain to fill our bellies? Or firewood? Or warm blankets for our beds?" She advanced on him with the switch she always seemed to have close to hand. Hand backed away from her, knowing from experience that a lifetime of hard work had given his mother a powerful arm. She'd raised welts on his back and shoulders, but he kept the boots. They were worth far more than what he'd given in trade, and he knew it. Willard had always been generous to Hand and Ma'am and Marie, his sister, because there was no man in the house, unless you counted Hand, and most people didn't, even though he was already 16 and nearly grown. Dancer brought water from Firehole Spring and splashed it over Hand's slimed boot. "Why is it that our nasty plants growing in nasty places are valuable?" Dancer said. "If they grow in a garden, who'd pay good money for them?" Hand growled, wiping his hand on his leggings. The silver cuffs around the wrist were caked with mud as well, deeply embedded in the delicate engravings. He'd better take a brush to them before he got home, and he'd hear about that too. It was a fitting end to a frustrating day. They'd been out since dawn, and all he had to show for it were 3 sulfur lilies, a large bag of cinnamon bark, some razor leaf, and maidenweed at the Flatlander market. His mother's empty purse had sent him foraging in the mountains too early in the season. "This is a waste of time," Hand said, though it had been his idea in the first place. He snatched up the rock and flung it into the mud pot, where it disappeared with a vicious plop. "Let's do something else." Dancer cocked his head, his beaded braids swinging. "What would you—" "Let's go hunting," Hand said, touching the bow slung across his back. Dancer frowned, thinking, "We could try Burnt Tree Meadow. The Fells deer are moving up from the flatlands. Bird saw them there day before yesterday. Let's go then. Han didn't have to think long about it. It was the hunger moon. The crocks of beans and cabbage and dried fish his mother has laid up for the long winter had evaporated. Even if he'd fancied sitting down to another meal of beans and cabbage, lately there's been nothing but porridge and more porridge, with the odd bit of salt meat for flavor. Meat for the table would more than make up for today's meager gleanings. They set off east, leaving the smoking springs behind. Dancer set of relentless ground-eating pace down the valley of the Durnwater. Han's bad mood began to wear away with the friction of physical extension. It was hard to stay angry on such a day. Signs of springs bloomed all around them. Skunk cabbages and maiden's kiss and May apples covered the ground, and Han breathed in the scent of warm earth freed from its winter covering. The Durn's water frothed over stones and roared over waterfalls, flooded by melting snow of the upper slopes. The day warmed as they descended, and soon Han removed his deerskin jacket and pushed his sleeves past his elbows. Burnt Tree Meadow was the site of a recent fire. In a few short years it would be reclaimed by forest, but for now it was a sea of tall grasses and wildflowers, studded with the standing trunks of charred lodgepole pines. Other trunks lay scattered like a giant's game of pitch sticks. Knee-high pine trees feared the ground, and blackberries and brambles basked in sunlight where there had once been deep pine forest shade. A dozen fell deer stood head down, gazing on the tender spring grasses. Their large ears flicked away insects, and their red hides shone like spots on paint against the browns and greens of the meadow. Han's pulse accelerated. Dancer was the better archer, more patient in choosing his shots, but Han saw no reason why they shouldn't each take a deer. His always empty stomach growled at the thought of fresh meat. Han and Dancer circled the meadow to the downwind side, downslope from the herd. Crouching behind a large rock, Han slid his bow free and tightened the slack bowstring, trying it with his callous thumb. The bow was new, made to match his recent growth. It was clan-made like everything in his life that married beauty and function. Han eased to his feet and drew the bowstring back to his ear. Then he paused, sniffing the air. The breeze carried the distant scent of wood smoke. His gaze traveled up the mountain and found a thin line of smoke cutting across the slope. He looked at Dancer and raised his eyebrow in inquiry. Dancer shrugged. The ground was soaked in the spring foliage, green and lush. Nothing should burn in this season. The deer in the meadow caught the scent too. They raised their heads, snorting and stamping their feet nervously, the whites showing in their liquid brown eyes. Han looked up at the mountain again. Now he could see orange, purple, and green flames at the base of the fire line. And the wind blowing down slope grew hot and thick with smoke. Purple and green, Han thought. Were there plants that burned with colors like those? The herd milled anxiously for a moment, as if not sure which way to go, and then turned as one and charged straight towards them. Han hastily raised his bow and managed to get off a shot as the deer bounded past. He missed completely. Dancer's luck was no better. Han sprinted after the herd, leaping over obstacles, hoping to try again, but it was no use. He caught the tantalizing glimpse of the white flags of their tails before the deer vanished into the pines. Muttering to himself, he trudged back to where Dancer stood. Staring up the mountain, the line of garnished flame rolled towards them, picking up speed, leaving a charred and desolate landscape in its wake. What is going on? Dancer shook his head. There's no burns this time of year. As they watched the fire gathered momentum, leaping small ravines, glittering embers landed on all sides, driven by the downslope wind. The heat seared the skin of Han's exposed face and hands. He shook ash from his hair and slapped sparks off his coat, beginning to realize their danger. Come on, we better get out of the way. He ran across the ridge, slipping and sliding on the shale and wet leaves, knowing a fall could mean disaster. They took refuge behind a rocky prominence that pierced the vegetative skin of the mountain. Rabbits, foxes, and other small animals galloped past just ahead of the flames. The fire line swept by, hissing and snapping, greedily consuming everything in its path. And after the three riders, like shepherds, driving the flame before them, Han stared, mesmerized. They were boys no older than Han and Dancer, but they wore a fine cloak of silk and summer wool that grazed the stirrups and long soles glittering with exotic emblems. The horses they rode were not compact, shaggy mountain ponies, but flatlander horses with long, delicate legs and proudly arched necks. Their saddles and bridles embellished with silver fittings. Han knew horseflesh, and those horses would cost a year's pay for a common person. A lifetime's earnings for him. The boys rode with a loose and easy arrogance, as if oblivious of the breathtaking landscape around them. Dancer went still, his bronze face hardening and his blue eyes going flat and opaque. Charmcasters, he breathed, using the clan term for wizards. I should have known. Charmcasters, Han thought, fear and excitement thrilling through him. He'd never seen one up close. Wizards did not consort with people like him. They lived in the elaborate palaces surrounding Fellsmarth Castle and attended the Queen at court. Many served as ambassadors to foreign countries. Purpose, Purposefully so, rumors of their power of sorcery kept foreign invaders away. The most powerful among them was named the High Wizard, advisor and magical enforcer of the Queen of the Fells. Stay away from wizards, ma'am always said. You don't want to be noticed by such as them. Get too close and you might get burned alive or turned into something foul and unholy. Common folks are like dirt under their feet. Like anything, forbidden wizards fascinated Han, but this was one rule he never had a chance to break. Charmcasters weren't allowed in the Spirit Mountains, except for their council house on Grey Lady, overlooking the Vale. Nor would they venture into Ragmarket, the gritty Felsmart's neighborhood Han called home. If they need some from the markets, they sent servants to purchase it. In this way, the three people of the Fells achieved a tenuous peace. The Wizard of the Northern Isles, the Vale folk of the Valley, and Upland clan. As the riders drew closer to their hiding place, Han studied them avidly. The Charmcaster in the lead had straight black hair that swept back from the widow's peak and hung to his shoulders. He wore multiple rings on his long fingers, and an intricately carved pendant hung from a heavy chain around his neck. No doubt it was some kind of powerful amulet. His soles were emblazoned with silver falcons, claws extended in attack. Silver falcons, Han thought. That must be the emblem of his wizard house. The other two were ginger-haired, with identical broad flattened noses and snarly felscats on their stoles. Han amused. They were brothers or cousins. They rode a little behind the black-haired wizard that seemed to defer to him. They wore the no amulets that Han could see. Han would have been content to remain hidden and watch them ride by, but Dancer had other ideas. He erupted from the shadows of the rocks, practically under the hooves of the horses, spooking them so the three riders had to fight to keep their seats. I am Fire Dancer, Dancer proclaimed loudly in the common speech of Marissa Pine's camp. He skipped right over the ritual welcome of the traveler and cut into the meat. The camp demands to know who you are and what wizards are doing on Helena, as is forbidden by the naming. Dancer stood tall, his hands fisted at his side, but he seemed small next to the three strangers on their horses. What's come over Dancer? Han wondered, reluctantly emerging from his hiding place to stand beside his friend. He didn't like that the Charmcasters were trespassing on their hunting ground either, but he was savvy enough not to go up against hex magic. The black-haired boy glared down at Dancer, then flinched, his black eyes widening in surprise before he resumed his cool, disdainful expression. Does he know Dancer? Han looked from one to the other. Dancer didn't seem to know him. Even though Han was taller than Dancer, the wizard's gazes seemed to flow over him like water over a rock, and then back at his friend. Han looked down at his mud-stained deerskin leggings and rag market shirt. Envying the stranger's finery, he felt invisible, insignificant. Dancer wasn't cowed by charmcasters. I asked your names, he said. He gestured toward the retreating flames. That looks like wizard flames to me. How does Dancer know what wizard flame looks like? He wondered. Or is he just bluffing? The boy with the falcon signet glanced at the others as if debating whether to respond. Getting no help from his friends, he turned back to Dancer. I'm Micah Bayer, of Airy House, he said, as if his very name would put them on their knees. We're here on the Queen's orders. Queen Morena and the Princess Reza and Melanie are hunting in the vale below. We're driving the deer down to meet them. The Queen ordered you to set fire to the mountains so she could have a good day's hunting? Dancer shook his head in disbelief. I said so, didn't I? Something in the wizard's expression told Han he wasn't being exactly truthful. The deer don't belong to the Queen, Han said. We've as much right to hunt them as she does. Anyway, you're underage, Dancer said. You're not allowed to use magic. Nor carry an amulet. He pointed to the jewel at Bayer's neck. How does Dancer know that? Han thought to himself. Knew nothing of wizard rules. Dancer must have struck a nerve because Bayer glared at him. That's wizard business, the charmcaster said, and no concern of yours. Well, Micah Jinxflinger, Dancer said, now resorting to clan insults for wizards. If Queen Morena wants to hunt deer in summer, she can come up to the high country after them, as she always has. Bayer raised black eyebrows. Where she can sleep on the dirt floor. Let's try that again. Bayer raised black eyebrows. Where she can sleep on the dirt floor, shoulder to shoulder with a dozen filthy kinsmen, and go a week without a hot bath, and come home stinking of wood smoke and sweat with a case of the night itches? He snorted with laughter, and his friends followed suit. I don't blame her for preferring the accommodations in the Vale. He doesn't know anything, Han thought, recalling the cozy lodges with their sleeping branches, the songs and stories told around the fire, the shared feast from the common pot. So many nights he'd fallen asleep under furs and clan-made blankets, with the thread of an old song winding through his dreams. Han wasn't clan, but he often wished he was. It was the one place he'd ever felt at home, the one place he didn't feel like he was clinging on by his fingernails. Princess Reza was fostered at Demonia camp for 3 years. Dancer said his chin thrust out stubbornly. The princess's clan-bred father had some archaic ideas, Bayer replied, and his companions laughed again. Me, I wouldn't want to marry a girl who spent time in the camps. I'd be afraid she'd been ruined. Suddenly, Dancer's knife was in his hand. Repeat that jinx flinger, Dancer said. His voice could as the Drinwater. Okay, hold on. Suddenly, Dancer's knife was in his hand. Repeat that, jinx flinger, Dancer said, his voice cold as the Dinswater. Bayard jerked hard on his reins, and his horse stepped back, putting more distance between Bayard and Dancer. I'd say women have more to fear from jinx flingers than from anyone in the camps, Dancer went on, his heart accelerating. Hen stepped up beside Dancer and put his hand on the hilt of his own knife, careful not to get in the way of Dancer's throwing arm. Dancer was quick on his feet and good with a blade. But a blade against magic? Even two blades? Relax, Copperhead. Bayard licked his lips, his eyes fixed on Dancer's knife. Here's the thing. My father says that girls who go to the camps come back proud of, opinionated, and difficult to manage. That's all. He smirked as if it were a joke they could all share. Dancer did not smile. Are you saying that the blooded heir to the throne of the Fells needs to be managed? Dancer, Hand said, but Dancer dismissed his warnings with a shake of his head. Hand seized up the three wizards as he would his opponents in any street fight. All three carried heavy, elaborate swords that hadn't seen much use. Get them down off their horses. Here's the thing, he thought. A quick slash to the cinch strap would do the trick. Getting close where their swords wouldn't do much good. Take out Bayard, and then the others will cut and run. One of the ginger-haired wizards cleared his throat nervously, as if uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation. He was the elder of the two, and stocky, with plump, pale, freckled hands that gripped his reins tightly. Mika, he said, in a veil, delicate, nodding toward the valley below. Come on, let's go. We'll miss the hunt. Hold on, Memphis. Bayard stared down at Dancer. Black-eyed glittered in his pale face. Aren't you called Hayden? He inquired in common, using Dancer's veil name. It's just Hayden, isn't it? And a mongrel name since you have no father? Dancer stiffened. That is my veil name, he said, lifting his chin. Definitely. My real name is Fire Dancer. Hayden is a wizard's name, Bayard said, fingering the amulet around his neck. How dare you presume? I presume nothing, Dancer said. I didn't choose it. I am Clan. Why would I choose a jinx flinger's name? Good question, Hand thought, looking from one to the other. Some among the clans used flatland names in the Vale, but why would a jinx finger like Mika Bayard know Dancer's Vale name? Bayard blushed. Bayard flushed red, and it took him a moment to muster a response. So you claim Hayden, Bayard drawled. Maybe you've fathered yourself, which means you and your mother. Dancer's arm flashed up, but Hand just managed to slam it aside as the Dancer's arm flashed up, but Hand just managed to slam it aside as the knife left his hand and it ended quivering in the trunk of a tree. Come on, Dancer, Hand thought, hunching his shoulders against his friend's furious glare. Killing a wizard friend of the queen would buy them a world of trouble. The Charmcaster Bear sat frozen a moment, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then his face went white with anger. He extended one imperious hand toward Dancer. He extended one imperious hand toward Dancer, took hold of his amulet with the other, and began muttering a charm in the language of magic, stumbling over the words a bit. Mika, the more slender Fellscat wizard, said, nudging his horse up close. No, it's not worth it. The fire was one thing. If they find out we shut up, Arcada, Bear replied. I'm going to teach this base-born copperhead respect. Looking put out that he was forced to start over and begin the charm again. Try to be a peacemaker and see where it gets you, Han thought. He unslung his bow and knocked an arrow aiming at Bear's chest. Hey Mika, he said, how about this? Shut it or I shoot. Bear squinted at Han as if once again surprised to see him, perhaps realizing he would indeed be dead before he could finish the hex. The wizard released the grip on the amulet and raised his hand. At the sight of Han's bow, Memphis and Arcada pawed at the hilts of their swords, but Dancer knocked his own arrow, and the boys let go and raised their hands as well. Smart move, Han said, nodding. I'm guessing jinxes are slower than arrows. You tried to murder me? Bear said to Dancer, as if amazed that such a thing could happen. Do you realize who I am? My father is High Wizard Consular of the Queen. When he finds out what you did, why don't you run back to Grey Lady and tell him all about it, Dancer said, jerking his head around the downslope trail. Go on, you don't belong here. Get off the mountain. Now. Bear didn't want to back off with his two friends as witnesses. Just remember, he said softly, fingering his amulet. It's a long way down the mountain. Anything can happen along the way. Bones, Hans thought. He'd been ambushed too many times in the streets and alleyways of Felsmarts. He knew enough about bullies to recognize the trait in Bear. This boy would hurt them if he could, and he wouldn't play fair doing it. Keeping his bowstring tight, Han pointed his chin at the wizard. You take off your jinx piece, he ordered. Throw it down on the ground. This? Bear touched the evil-looking jewel that hung around his neck. When Han nodded, the boy shook his head. You can't be serious, he snarled, closing his fist around it. Do you know what this is? I have an idea, Han said. He gestured with the bow. Take it off and throw it down. Bear sat frozen, his face going pale. You can't use this, you know, he said, looking from Han to Dancer. If you even touch it, you'll be incinerated. We'll take our chances, Dancer said, glancing over at Han. The Charmcaster's eyes narrowed. You're nothing more than thieves, then, he sneered. I should have known. Use your head, Han said. What would I do with trunk like that? I just don't want to have to be looking over my shoulder all the way home. Arcada leaned in toward Bear and muttered in Vale's speech. Better give it to him. You know what they say about the copperheads. They'll cut your throat and drink your blood and feed you to their wolves so no one will ever find your bones. Memphis nodded vigorously. Or they'll use us in rituals, they'll burn us alive. Sacrifices used to their goddesses. Hand clenched his jaw, struggling to keep the surprise and amusement off his face. It seems the Jinx Fingers had their own reasons to fear the clan. I can't give it to them, you idiot. Hold on. I can't give it to them, you idiot, Bayer hissed. You know why. If my father finds out I took it, we'll all be punished. I told you not to take it, Arquetta said. Arquetta muttered. I told you it was a bad idea just because you want to impress Princess Reza. You know I wouldn't have taken it if we were allowed to have our own, Bayer said. It was the only one What are you looking at? He demanded, noticing Han and Dancer's interest in the conversation and maybe realizing for the first time that they understood the Flatlander language. I'm looking at someone who's already in trouble and getting in deeper, Han said. Now drop the amulet. Bayer glared at Han as if actually seeing him for the first time. You're not even clan. Who are you? Han knew better than to hand his name to an enemy. They call me Shiv, he said, fishing a name out of memory, street lord of Southbridge. Shiv, you say? The wizard tried to stare him down, but his gaze kept sliding away. It's strange. There's something you seem... His voice trailed off as if he lost track of the thought. Hand sighted down the shaft of his arrow, feeling sweat trickling down between the shoulder blades. If Bayer wouldn't give, he'd have to figure out what to do next. Just then, he had no clue. I'll count to 5, he said, hanging on to his street face. When I put an arrow through your neck... 1. With a quick, vicious movement, Bayer yanked the chain over his head and tossed the amulet to the ground. It clinked softly as it landed. Just try to pick it up, the Charmcaster said, leaning forward in his saddle. I dare you. Han looked from Bayer to the Jinx piece, unsure whether to believe him or not. Go on, get out of here, Dancer said. I reckon you better think about how you're going to put that fire out. If you don't, I guarantee the Queen won't be happy whether she asks you to start it or not. Bayer stared at him for a moment, lips twitching with unspoken words. Then he wrenched his mount's head around and drove his knees into his horse's side. Horse and rider charged downslope as if they were, in fact, trying to catch the fire. Arquetta stared after him, then turned to Dancer, shaking his head. You fools, how is he supposed to put it out without the amulet? He wheeled his horse and the two wizards followed Bayer at a slightly less reckless pace. I hope he breaks his neck, Dancer muttered, staring after the 3 Charmcasters. Han let out a breath and released the tension on his bow, slinging it across his shoulder. What was all that about your veil name? Have you met Bayer before? Dancer jammed his arrow back in his quiver. Where would I meet a Jinx flinger? Why did he say what he did about your father? Han persisted. How does he know that? How should I know? Dancer said, his face hard and furious. Forget about it. Let's go. Obviously, Dancer didn't want to talk about it. Fine, Han thought. He had no room to complain. He had enough secrets of his own. What about this thing? Han squatted and studied the Jinx piece warily, afraid to touch it. Do you think he was bluffing? He looked up at Dancer, who was watching from a safe distance. I mean, do you think you need this thing to put the fire out? Just leave it, Dancer said, shuddering. Let's get out of here. That Jinx Flinger didn't want to give this thing up, Han mused. Must be valuable. Han knew traders of magical pieces in Ragmark Market. He dealt with them a time or two when he worked the streets. A taking like this could pay the rent for a year. You're not a thief, not anymore. If he said it often enough, it just might stick. But he couldn't let it lie. There was something malevolent yet fascinating about the amulet. Power emanated from it like heat from a stove on a cold day. It warmed. Alright, hold on. Power emanated from it like a heat from a stove on a cold day. It warmed his front, making the rest of him feel colder by comparison. Using a stick, he lifted the amulet by its chain. It dangled, spinning hypnotically in the sunlight. A green, translucent stone cunningly carved into the snarl of a serpent with ruby eyes. The staff was topped with a brilliant round-cut diamond, larger than he'd ever seen. The snake's eyes were blood-red rubies. Han had dealt with jewelry from time to time, and he could tell the craftsmanship was exquisite, and the stones were prime quality, but the lure of the piece went beyond the sum of its parts. What are you going to do with that? Dancer asked. Behind him, his voice overgrown with disapproval. Han shrugged, still watching the spinning jewel. I don't know. Dancer shook his head. You should pitch it into the ravine. If Bayard took the thing without permission, let him explain what happened to it. Han was unable to fathom pitching it away. It didn't seem like the kind of thing you want to leave lying around for somebody. Maybe a child from the camps to find? Han fished a square of leather from his carry bag, and he wrapped it carefully and tucked it into his bag. All the time wondering, how had it come to this? How had he and Dancer ended up in a standoff with wizards? What was the connection between them and Dancer? Maybe it was just the latest in a long line of bad luck. Han always seemed to find trouble no matter how hard he tried to avoid it. And that is chapter 1. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next video in this kinda side series.